podcast is real life stories from everyday people in recovery. From mental health issues, trauma, substance misuse, and behavioural addictions. Please visit the website www.lifeinrecovery.co.uk for links to social media and a range of books written by your podcast host, Bren Coy.
Yes, I was born in the Midlands in 1982, and I was born in a really small village that was kind of isolated and very white, very heterosexual, very normative, and I have one sister, and when I was 7, my mum and dad got divorced, and I think that was quite problematic for me as a child because I didn't really know where I stood from that point on. And I think being so young, I wasn't really aware of the kind of mechanisms of relationships and what happens, and that relationships can fail, and that basically my dad had met somebody else and he'd had an affair with this woman. And eventually my mum found out, and then they separated and eventually divorced. It was a very kind of like long process for them to go through that. And I think as a child, that really affected me, although I didn't really understand it there and then. And I think when they divorced, things really changed for me. Like I became kind of more problematic. And I just was preoccupied by other things. And I'm mentioning this to start off with because I do really feel like, for me, addiction starts with trauma, and that was a really traumatic experience to go through. And being in the 80s, like we were like a low-income family, and there was really not much support for anybody who was going through divorce or separation. And I certainly didn't know any friends whose parents had gone through a divorce or separation. I think my family was kind of one of the first on our estates to go through that. And so that felt very alienating for me because it felt like I didn't have anyone to talk to or share about my experience, like what I was feeling. And I obviously couldn't really talk to my mum and dad because they were preoccupied with their own stuff. And my sister was like 2 years old at that point, so she doesn't really remember much of this, and for her it wasn't so much of a problem. But being older, like I was just super aware of the fact that things had changed, but not really understanding why. And so kind of like growing up, I always felt this sort of like lack of or something, and I think I had these really internalized beliefs set when I was that age that like something had happened that was my fault. And so the fact that my dad had left my mom, the fact that their relationship had failed, meant that like we weren't good enough as a family. We wanted to go and start a different family somewhere else, and that meant that like I wasn't then somehow enough for him. And eventually he did do that. Eventually he married this woman that he was seeing, and they started to have children. And that really just like compounded the fact that I thought that like we weren't enough for him. And I think when I was younger, obviously like as a child, I didn't have alcohol and drugs available to me, but what I had was food and sugar. And I think that's for me where my addiction really started, was with like handfuls of biscuits. I remember just like going to the biscuit jar and just grabbing handfuls of biscuits at a time and just eating them. And we like shopped at this supermarket called Quick Save, and we lived on their like no frills range, which was like really basic stuff. And so these biscuits were just like disgusting. They were just like air. They were like nothing. They were these cookies you could buy like a packet for like 17p. And like as soon as we bought them from the supermarket, they were gone. Like I would just eat them and eat them and eat them. And as a result of that, like I was quite an overweight child, but it was never really addressed. And as a result of that, I was also then bullied because I was overweight and I couldn't do sports and everything. So like it just made me want to eat more. And at the time, my mum was working as a kitchen assistant, so sometimes she would bring back food, and like she'd bring back like bowls of cream and stuff like that the people that she was working for wouldn't eat, and I would just be in it, like could not stop eating it. And that just for me, just I've only learned this since coming into recovery, but that really is just like the place where it all began, where I was going through so much like turmoil at home that the only escape I had was like eating, because it was just like medicine. It really helped me just kind of zone out from all the shit that was going on. And so yeah, I think what's also like important to mention is that like now I understand myself to be a transgender woman, but this wasn't how I was born. So I was obviously like born a boy, and kind of growing up, I always had this sense of not feeling connected to that identity. And I suppose in some respects, like I was very quickly, like people used to label me as being feminine. And so in the 80s, and probably still now to a big degree, like if you're a feminine boy, like you get a lot of hassle for that. And so growing up in a very small sort of conservative village where there's not much outside influence, like there wasn't even any black people in our village or any people of color, like with no outside influences, it's really insular. And so I started to get a lot of abuse from people, particularly like older guys on the estate and everything, for being this feminine boy. And in the 80s, like you didn't have the language around it. Like we couldn't understand what transgender was back then. And people just assumed that if you were a feminine boy, you were gay, or if you were a butch woman, you were a lesbian. But it's so more nuanced, that conversation, but we just didn't have the vocabulary around it. And also what was happening to like set the scene in the UK is that the Tory government had implemented a law called Section 28. And Section 28 meant that homosexuality or any LGBTQ issues in schools couldn't be discussed. So it created a lot of shame and fear around sexualities, particularly sexualities that weren't heterosexual. And so growing up, I knew from a young age that I was attracted to heterosexual people. So I was attracted to men and masculinity, but I'd internalized the thought that this was wrong. And I'd internalized the idea that I was feminine was wrong, because there was no role models. There was no one you could talk to about it, because no one could talk about it. There was nothing in the media or on TV that spoke to identities that were transgender or homosexual that wasn't derogatory. So it meant that I internalized all this nonsense, that I just wasn't good enough, so that I wasn't the best boy, I wasn't this or I wasn't that. And that combined with the fact that my mum and dad had broken up and that my home was now like a broken home, it just was like crazy, because I was just like not able to deal with all that weight of stuff and had no outlet for it. And my outlet became food at that point.
Must have been a very, very lonely place to be.
Yeah, when I think so, I just remember, like, when I think about my childhood, I just think I spent a lot of time in my room on my own, because it was literally like the house didn't really feel safe, because I didn't know what was happening with my parents. And on the estate that I grew up in, it like didn't feel safe, because if I went outside, I would probably get verbally abused. At the time, I had like my main friends were female friends, and I just could never make connections with guys, because I wasn't kind of making I wasn't able to do the same things as them. And I just felt much more affiliated with women. And because I had more female friends, that made the guys really angry, even more angry, because they couldn't be friends with the girls like I could be. So it just meant that I had like so much more to deal with. And yeah, I think what also happened though is like I was, and this is true for most of my life in addiction, is like I've always been quite a high achiever. That addiction has really pushed me to work hard to achieve a lot in my life as a way of kind of trying to squash the fear almost. So even though like home was difficult and the village I grew up in was difficult, I really tried to do well at school because it was a place where I could prove myself and I could prove my worth. And one of the things I was really interested in was art and being creative, which has since become my career. But I can see the signs like early on, like I just was obsessed by art. I really wanted to like always make art and be creative. And that was something which really held me together, actually. It really allowed me to feel like I actually had some sense of belonging because I knew I could be good at something, and that was nice.
I was exactly the same as that, because I did a fine art degree, and
Yeah.
and I think that I've recognised as well, it was a means of escape, you know, to escape into your creativity.
Yeah. I think growing up, things really started to change when people's like puberty kicked in and people became aware of sexuality. As a child, like there's kind of a naivety in some sense, and that was kind of nice because people aren't so preoccupied. But I remember like when boys started to like talk about sex and want sex, and like that became like a really big thing in primary school, the last year of primary school before we went to high school. And that's really when the difference between me and the rest of the boys was really kind of like noticeable, because I wasn't talking about like wanting to have sex with girls and stuff like that, but I couldn't really share what I wanted, because still like there was just so much kind of negativity around sexuality if it wasn't heterosexual. And so going into high school, that just was like, it blew up even more, and it was really difficult then. And that's when I think the next addiction for me after food was smoking, and smoking cigarettes. And I started smoking cigarettes at a really young age. I think 13 I started smoking, and that was really about secrets and hiding. And I used to go down to the woods with some of the older girls that I was friends with and smoke with them. And there'd always be someone you could get cigarettes from who lived on the estate. You know, you'd give them like an extra £1 and they'd go and buy you a pack of cigarettes. I mean, it wasn't much back then to buy cigarettes, so it was really accessible for us. And then alcohol and marijuana came into my life like very quickly as well. I think I was about 14 when I started to drink and smoke drugs. The first drink I had was like a 2-litre bottle of cider down the fields, and I don't remember anything of it. It was like my first drink was a blackout, and I remember like planning this like night with my friend Bethany, and we went to the fields and started drinking. And then from that moment on, I don't remember anything. I just remember waking up in her house the next day on her sofa with her mum trying to feed me some like Marmite on toast. And the thing about that is like I was 14, me back to her house because I was like throwing up, and I was throwing up all in Bethany's front room, so I had to sleep there because they didn't want to take me back to my mum's in that state. So I mean, I just don't remember anything of it at all. But that was like the pattern that continued. And because we lived in a small village and there was only like, you know, a handful of buses that went to the nearest town, we just felt really isolated. And I think drugs and alcohol was just a way of dealing with the boredom. It really was. Like, this is obviously like mid-90s. There was no internet then. It was like 5 channels on the telly and magazines and records. And so I just devoured like magazines and loved music, and that really kind of held me together. That really was an outlet. And I know now that like a lot of that behavior was anorexic, which I'll talk about like when I get into it later. But yeah, it was just quite isolating, I think. Like I still knew.
I just wanted to say, I love what you said before as well about it, the food was a medication to your trauma, because that is exactly how I see addiction. You know, like the substance or the behavior is your attempt at medicating the emotional and mental health issues as a result of the trauma. And I think that might not necessarily be the case with every single addict, but I think the vast majority of them have got some sort of subjective traumatic experiences, whether like this parents splitting up, for example, as you said, or you know, it could be, I don't know, being bullied or anything. Like there's always something that creates some sort of emotional disorder, which leads to mental health issues like depression and anxiety, and like you said, boredom, frustration, restless irritability and discontentment. And then we're using these substances to just make us feel better, essentially. And obviously they become a crutch because they solve the problem, don't they?
Exactly. And just picking up from there, like what happened when my parents divorced when I was 6, 7, is I started emotional abandonment. So for me, that's key. I was emotionally abandoned through no fault of my parents doing. They weren't aware of this and they didn't know this, but I was emotionally abandoned because my dad went off to have a relationship with a new woman and they had kids, and it meant that then I stopped seeing my father because he lived in a different town. I would only see him at weekends, and like at that pivotal point in my life when I was 7 years old, I lost contact with my father. And so when somebody's caregiver is absent, that creates a huge void. And I didn't know why I didn't really know for a long time why my dad had gone, where he had gone, and like what the plan was. And also my mother, she held it together as best she could. I mean, obviously that's a huge blow for your partner to walk out on you and to leave you with 2 children, to manage when she had a low income. She hadn't left school, she hadn't got her like exams, she was young. Like she held it together, but I saw the cracks. She was a mess for a good few years because she was trying to manage this, and so her unmanageability crept into kind of my life, and then I took on responsibility. So then I had to become like a provider in the house. So I had to care for my sister. I had to do things like, it sounds silly, but it's like actually a big thing. Like I had to maintain the fire in the house. So I was just taking on adult responsibilities, and as a result, like I was sort of becoming enmeshed in her life, and um, and what was happening was my dad became a villain, like because he was like this really bad man who'd done something bad. And when I was 7, I was like, yeah, he's bad. He's walked out on me. And my mom and her family created this narrative, which was like, he's awful. He's really just wrong and bad. You shouldn't have anything to do with him. And his new wife is a witch. That's literally what they said to me. And so I was just like believing this, because why wouldn't I? Because they're my caregivers, you know. So it was kind of really messed up in a way, because it just changed so much. And so I think that although alcoholism isn't present in my family, there are other isms or addictions which are present, and one of those is codependency, and one of those is sex and love addiction, which I'll talk about like when I get to it in my story. But even though my parents aren't alcoholics, I would say that these other things are very present in their lives. So in terms of being emotionally abandoned, my mum started to have relationships with men eventually, and so it was kind of great for her to sort of rebuild her life. But what happened very quickly was that her relationships took over her life, and so therefore like I was not necessarily the number one priority. So it was like that was what was happening basically. And so the relationship with my father never got fixed, and since deteriorated even more. But it's like it was always just like this kind of really big thing that I didn't have a relationship with my dad, and therefore somehow like this was kind of I thought of that as just all my own fault. And so I was sort of like taking on all this extra mental stuff that I didn't need to deal with as a child. I think like when I started drinking and taking drugs, it was very easy to like fall into those patterns of going out every weekend and getting really smashed. And that's what we did like as teenagers, which I think to some sense like most teenagers do. But I think that sort of blackout drinking was always just kind of there and present, and it just carried on really. Everything sort of escalated when I moved to London. Like when I was 18, I just knew that I had to get out of that small village, because I couldn't live the way I wanted to live, because when I was 18, I still hadn't put the pieces together that I was trans. So sort of like I was sort of a gay, I was still presenting as male and I was gay, but I couldn't be gay in that village because there was no other gay people in the village.
I wanted to ask you that actually. Like, at what age did you feel sexually different, or how did that feel at a young age?
I knew from about the ages of like 8 and 10, because I remember because I was friends with so many girls, like when they'd all be like talking about which member of Take That they fancied, like I knew I fancied like someone from Take That, but I couldn't really share that information, because I knew that if that came out, like then it would just create more problems. So I just kind of like hid it away. I mean, it wasn't like I hid it away because other people knew. Like I got bullied because people said I was gay, so people saw it, but I didn't want to actually admit it because there was still so much shame and fear around it. And that was really tough to kind of hold that together. And I think like in some respects, being a teenager and not being able to live to my fullest kind of capacity as a teenager meant that I did it when I moved to London. So from the ages of like 18 to 28, I was fucking wild, because I was making up for all that lost time when I was just hiding away in my bedroom trying to kind of like get on with stuff, because I really had something to prove and I had to find something out. I was really grateful actually that hard drugs never came into my life till much later. And so when I moved to London, like I loved it in the sense that I was anonymous and I could just live the life that I wanted to live, and I didn't feel like anybody was like twitching at the neck curtains like they were in the village. Like there was no more like having to hide anything. And really what also happened when I moved to London is I really lost contact with my family, because I knew that they would find it difficult dealing with the reality of my situation. I was kind of like trying to work things out. So those relationships and those bonds just got further away. So I just kind of got a lot more lost in my own stuff. And I was doing things that I didn't really expect myself to do, because I think I've always been quite easily led, very easily led, because I've never been able to sort of like form my own belief system. So if somebody says to me like, oh, it would take somebody to say to me, you're really good at that, for me to think I'm good at that. Like I don't have like my own worth, my own value system before recovery was really screwed, because I didn't have enough self-worth of my own to believe what I was doing was positive or whatever. So I got really easily led. So I think I started doing things which I'd always wanted to do, but like it just escalated when I came to London, because there was so much more possibilities. And I did my BA was in jewellery design at Middlesex University. I'd like followed my desire to make creativity in my life, and I'd like came to London to be a student. And I remember even my dad being like, before I left, my dad being like, are you sure you really need to go to London? Like, can't you just stay here? And I just knew that he hadn't got a sense of like who I was and what my life was about. And that was quite difficult. And I think also that was because he'd stayed in the village his whole life. That was his life. And I think he maybe resented me a bit that I was actually kind of like getting out and going and living a life outside of that. But when I was like 18, I still didn't kind of comprehend that, I suppose. And when I came to London, I just really got into clubbing really quickly, because I just didn't have clubbing before I moved to London. And like Soho and Camden, like it was just so exciting. Like it was at that point, like in the year 2000, I think London was really great for like 10 years, and there was so much good stuff happening. And it was brilliant. Like I had a good time being a student, but I was so weird, and I only worked this out recently. It's like this kind of idea of workaholism was because I would go out on like a Thursday night, for example, and stay out till like 3 a.m. And then I'd go to university the next morning for a lecture at like 10 a.m., having only had like 4 hours sleep, stinking of booze. But it was like I had something to prove, like I had to be there for that lecture. Like I couldn't ever sort of not, I couldn't fathom like not being successful in my career, because it was really important for me to prove something. But at the same time, like I was really sort of, I was not present when I was there, because how could it be? Because I was hungover and still kind of like tired from not having any sleep. So it wasn't necessarily the best way of me kind of like maintaining a healthy lifestyle.
It was like low self-esteem was driving this, really, wasn't it, by the sounds of it?
Exactly. Yeah. I think in some respects, like I really felt like I found my tribe when I went to London. Also, like there was a sense of like all these misfits, like finding each other, like people in like the club community and the art community. And then like Shoreditch happened, and Shoreditch was like all of a sudden blew up, and like it was nice to be around there then, because it was like, oh, there just seemed like limitless possibilities. And in a sense, for me, I think it was like the limitlessness was like basically I could go out 6 days a week and just like be completely high, be completely drunk, and I made that my life for a very long time. And what happened when I left university is like, I think at university I was beginning to understand that I was trans, and being in London I was really able to put some pieces together and also see other trans women. I'd never really had that exposure before, and going out in clubs was like where I saw people and I could relate to, and eventually I became friends with those people, started having conversations with trans women, started to kind of like think about my own transition. But I was so messed up in my own head that I couldn't comprehend how I could do it yet. And so that was helpful in some respects, but it was like I was starting to realize I needed to do something, but the drinking and the drugging and everything else was really holding me back. Yeah, I think it was just like it slowly escalated to the point of coming in recovery, I suppose. Like the last 5 or 6 years of my drinking had got to the point where, so yeah, I was working in this is what I wanted to say. I was working in nightclubs, and I started doing like the doors of nightclubs. So I was working on guest lists, and I loved that because it gave me a sense of like authority and
Power.
Exactly. It was like I could choose whether or not you were coming into the club.
Yeah.
And
how the roles have reversed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant for that self-esteem. Yeah.
And then that escalated into me becoming a performer at the club. So I would like create these like small cabaret performances, and then dress in really crazy club outfits. And I mean, if people are into club culture, you probably get a sense of what that looks like. But for me, it was always like this striving to like look the best, be seen at every nightclub. Like there's such a need and a thirst for fame and like notoriety and like iconism. Like it was just incessant, really. It was like, I remember like every week these magazines used to come out like documenting the week in clubs before, and like we all used to get these magazines and like really like hope we were in them. Like it meant so much to fill like scrapbooks up with this stuff. Like
I'm smiling because I completely relate to that, because I was in Leeds doing exactly the same thing, and I was like desperate to be in Mixed Mag every month, So yeah. Totally relate to that.
Yeah, and it was like in some respects I think back on that time, and I'm just like, wow, it was amazing to be in that time at that place and to have those experiences. And some of the doors that opened for me meant that like it was a foundation to some of the things I'm doing today. Like it's all part of the journey. Obviously sort of maintaining that lifestyle of being out and in the club world like 6 nights a week. What people don't see is like the hangovers, the come downs, the unmanageability in your career, your finances, like living, like when I was in that world, like my self needs and self care went out the window. Like I never went to the dentist, I never went to the opticians. Like things were messy behind the scenes. My come downs and my hangovers were awful. You know, I wanted to kill myself every Tuesday. Like literally was like this routine of like once one come down was over, it was all ready for the next high. It was just like you forgot that on Tuesday you wanted to die. And
yeah.
And so it was just like that. It was just mad in that respect, but wonderful, but mad. I think I think about it, and yeah, and things are just kind of getting to the point where I would go out on a Friday and I'd still be out on a Sunday. I wouldn't have slept. I wouldn't have showered. I wouldn't have brushed my teeth. I wouldn't have changed my clothes. Like, and I got into scrapes, but somehow I managed to survive and got through it. But it was like, you know, it was dicey at times. And so yeah, that was what was happening really. And I think in some respects I had so much like resentfulness at myself that I couldn't be like, that I wasn't living as trans, like I wasn't living as Ryhannon. Like it was so confusing because on one hand I was like, I know I need to do this, but on the other hand I was like, I can't do this, there's too much fear around it. And one of the things which really changed stuff for me was like in 2011, so a year before I went into recovery, Channel 4 showed this documentary series called My Transsexual Summer, and it followed like the lives of like 6 young transgender people for like this summer. And it was amazing for me because I was like, oh my God, I can do that. Like it all of a sudden made like trans identity seem like valuable and like important and natural, and like it just like made me go, oh my God, that's what I need to do and I can do it. Before that I always was like, somehow those internalized beliefs that being trans was wrong and like ingenuine, like I believed that, so I couldn't act upon it. And yeah, I was also in relationships. So I was in relationships in the sense that the dynamic of those relationships were 2 men, so they were like homosexual relationships. And so I felt trapped in that relationship because I couldn't necessarily like exhibit feminine traits because of the nature of the system I was in. So I felt very closed and shut off. And so I knew that having to like make that step and that leap and say I'm trans, this is how I want to live, at that point would mean the end of that relationship that I was in, which was 2 years into it. But yeah, it was something that I knew I needed to do. I think it was like trying to find the right time and the right headspace to do it. But in the meantime, like drinking and taking drugs and performing and living that lifestyle was like taking up so much of my time that I really couldn't focus on it at all.
And you said earlier that you got into harder drugs later on. What did that look like?
Harder drugs were ecstasy, MDMA, cocaine, ketamine. I loved things that like, I loved uppers basically because I had a low self-esteem, and like most of the time I was morose and I was down and sort of depressive and ridden with anxiety. Anything that made me feel high and created like dopamine just made me feel great, and I loved it. Like there was nothing that could stop me. And it soon went from like needing 1 ecstasy pill on a night out to needing 4. Like I couldn't just go out knowing that I had like 1 pill or half a pill. Like I needed more because I knew that I needed to get even higher and higher. And for me, when I took like 4 ecstasy tablets, like I was just a complete, like I would just be like sat on the floor in a club, like completely zoned out, thinking I was having a really great time. But the reality was like I wasn't like making connections with people. I wasn't talking to people. I wasn't dancing. I wasn't like part of the party. I was just zoned out in my head, and it was the same zoned outness that I was when I was a child and I was eating biscuits, watching TV. It was exactly the same thing.
So funny because your life is literally like the parallel to mine. Like when I was a kid, I was zoned out, eating sugar, watching TV and drawing and painting, and that was me. And then when I was clubbing, I was doing exactly the same thing. I wrote in one of my books actually about the last time, I think it was the last time I ever took ecstasy. I did 10 E's on New Year's Eve, and I did 10 E's on New Year's Day. And I remember being stood on the dance floor on New Year's Day, and it didn't even work anymore. It was like the pills were rattling around inside me, you know, like I'd gone through that stage of like monginess on the floor to literally like this. I could have taken another 10 and it wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever, because I'd just gone past it, you know. And the come downs were just, they were horrendous. And fortunately, I had like a friendship intervention. So I was with a girl at the time, and I'd been with her all the way through university, and her friends kind of sat me down in a room and was just like, look, you need to stop. Like, you know, that new year was just off the scale. And so I was like, okay. And then I just started using more cocaine instead. Just stopped the pills, and I was taking cocaine like 3 times a week. So yeah, I relate heavily to what you're saying. And it's just like and I want to ask you about this a bit later on, about the soul and the spirit or consciousness, whatever you want to kind of call it. But for me, you know, that light, that pilot light, that soul of mine had just been extinguished. You know, it was like the lights had gone off. There was nobody home anymore, really. And it is just depression, isn't it? Just complete depression. So I'm with you all the way. And one question, I'm sure you're going to get to it in a minute, but one question I wanted to ask you, because I actually met you probably 2010, 2011, because that was when I was first in recovery. Might have been a little bit later. So had you not transitioned before you came into recovery? You hadn't?
Yeah, I had, yeah.
You had? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 2011 was when I was really putting the pieces together. And what was also happening in 2011 is that, for me, what I now know, jumping ahead a little bit, what I now know for me is like, being an alcoholic is not my main issue. Although I accessed like AA, the first recovery that I went into, actually what's a bigger addiction for me is sex and love addiction. And I didn't access that straight away, because I needed to have some time in sobriety before I even understood what that meant. But so for my alcoholism was masking sex and love addiction, which was masking a really sort of like anorexic viewpoint of life and towards myself. So yeah, like you say, this idea of the pilot light being off, like I knew who I was or who I wanted to be, but I didn't know who I was and wanted to be. Like it was just like, give me anything to make me feel better, whatever that may be. And I remember the first time that Meow Meow came out. That was such a huge drug in my life when that came out. Like, I remember being at a festival and someone being like, "We've got this new drug. It's called Meow Meow. Try it." And we were just kind of like thinking, this woman's selling us like sherbet or something. Like, what the hell is this? And it wasn't. And that was just like, I'd never felt like so engaged in all my life as I was when I was like on that. And that's the thing with drugs. And I totally relate to what you say, being like, it did get to a point where it stopped working, because like the more I had, like the more I needed. And I suppose like if I hadn't stopped when I did, I would have gone, I can easily have seen myself getting into harder drugs like crack or heroin. But I think the thing that saved me from that was that I didn't know people that did it.
Yeah.
If I knew people that did it, I would have gone there. No doubt.
Yeah, I was the same as that. I mean, I was lucky because I missed the whole Meow Meow thing. I went to Australia in 2009, which was when I got sober. And when I came back, all my old raving buddies had got into these drugs, and they were like, "Oh, we're into this and this," and I was like, "What the hell is that? Like bath salts and all this crazy shit." I was like, "What?" So yeah, I was very lucky that I didn't. They were saying like, there's one. Is it Meow Meow where you smell like fish food? Is that the the one?
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes you smell like fish food. I was like, I'm glad I missed that one.
You totally are, yeah. I mean, it was just dirty and cheap, and it was like, it's just kind of like took you to that next level. And I always have to remember that, because I never went into NA, but you know, like drugs were really a big thing for me. And this is another thing that people, like you said, friendship intervention. Like, I never really saw drugs as being a problem, but when I speak to people about that time, they're like, "Oh my God, you were like always high or always had a come down." I never actually was able to acknowledge the extent of my behavior and how and how detrimental it was to me, but also my friendships. You know, that's another thing that suffered. It's like within being in kind of like club world, it was like I thought I had all these friends, but actually the people who were very close to me and the people that really knew me were very thin on the ground when it really mattered. Yeah, 2011 was a big year. It was like I saw this documentary on Channel 4. I knew that I had to transition. I felt like, in some respects, I was like, this is the answer. This will save it. This will be the answer to all my problems. This is what I need to do. And in some sense, I believed that. But also, what I hadn't got my head around by that point was the fact that I was an addiction because of childhood trauma. So in 2011, I also was hugely into pornography, and like that became a really big problem for me, where I would spend like copious amounts of hours every day consuming pornography. And because I worked at night, like I had no responsibilities in the day. Like when I got up like late, I could just do what I wanted and faff around for ages. And like I think that's important to mention because of the isolation factor. I was going out at night and being like heralded, and like people, you know, applauded me for what I was doing, but in the day I was on my own. And that's, for me, is like when my mind wants to soothe, because it's going back to the abandonment I felt as a child. So pornography was easy to do that. Like it still worked. And I spent, you know, huge amounts of time, huge amounts of money on content, like endlessly scrolling away for stuff. And like it was just really consuming of a lot of things. And it also meant that I was absent in my relationship, because I was spending so much time outside of the relationship sexually with myself that I couldn't actually give him the care and love and needs that he needed addressing, because I was just gone, really. But I didn't know that like what I was doing then was addictive. I just thought I was watching a lot of porn, but actually it was really detrimental to my health as alcohol was. Really, it took away the same things.
I think it can also become a form of cheating as well, can't it? If you're in a relationship and you're, like you just said then, it's meaning that you're absent from that relationship. I think a lot of that is to do with fantasy, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
And depending on how your mind works and what your fantasies are, ultimately you're kind of like living in your own mind in this alternate reality, getting your physical needs met, and it's like it's you're cheating the other person out of you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. No, that's really clear. That's exactly what I was doing. And that behavior, I suppose, much in the same way of drinking and taking drugs, because for me it becomes so routine very quickly, and it becomes habitual and part of my routine. And then so pornography became part of my daily routine. It was like it was my morning practice, basically. And that morning practice,
good way of putting it.
that was 2 or 3 hours long, and I
Yeah.
didn't see that as being a problem. That's how far away from kind of reality I was at that point. And so yeah, 2012, like I had a really big awakening. The start of 2012, I knew I had to transition, and I think I'd gone and spoke to a really close friend who was also transitioning, and she was like, "You just need to do it." And I was like, "I just need to do it. The longer I think about it and worry about it and stress about it, I'm never going to find out. And the more I'm just going to like get involved in like all sorts of kind of like weird stuff, weird being like drinking, drugging situations. Like the places I found myself in when I was drinking and drugging, like were places I would never intend to go to. So they were like really debauched drinking dens. They were like sex clubs. They were like all sorts of places like that. And so I knew that I had to like. So I thought, why don't I actually initiate this transition and find out? Actually, that's the only way I'm going to know if it's the right thing to do. So I had to tell my partner of 2 years, and that ultimately ended the relationship. And then I just had to sort of like start living as Ryhannon, as a woman. And then one of the big final drinks was I went out with a friend to one of these secret cinema events, and there we met 2 people. And then from there we went to another club, and from there we went to another club, and at some point, like, I just completely blacked out, and I came to, and I woke up and I was having sex with a man that I didn't even know who he was. I was in some alleyway somewhere, and other people were watching me, and like it was really an out of body experience, because I was like, what the hell am I doing to myself? Like, how have I ended up in this situation? And the thing was that then I went back into a blackout. So I came out of one blackout, noticed what I was doing, noticed what was happening to me, and then went back into another blackout. And the next time I came out of blackout, I was walking down this road. It was like 3-4 a.m. in like Limehouse in East London. Like, it was dodgy, and you know, it could have been a lot worse. And thankfully I remember getting into a taxi. I mean, I was a mess, because, you know, I was sort of like dressing as a woman at that point, and all the clothes that I was wearing were ripped. Like, I had makeup all over my face, like, you know, I'd been out on the lash for like 6 or 8 hours, like, and I got into a taxi and thankfully got home. But it was just like one of the first times I realized that I'm really putting myself in danger now, really like going to these extremes, and that's not great. I'm not gonna be able to survive if I do that. And then March of 2012, like, I had my 30th birthday, and so I organized like a really big house party at the house I was living in, and like it was the first time I really like dressed in a way that I could tell my close circle of friends that what I was planning to do and everything. So there was like a lot of weight on it, and I got completely smashed at my 30th birthday, and friends brought cocaine, and so I realized like what I was doing is like, instead of again, like, I was downstairs in like the basement rooms of the house, like just doing cocaine with like 2 or 3 other people, and I was actually like really away from the people that wanted to spend time with me, that wanted to like be there for my birthday. So I was absent. And then after that party was like winding down at 3 a.m., I wasn't ready to go to bed because I was so high on coke still. And so there's like the other people that had been taking drugs. We were like, let's go to a house party. Someone knew a house party that was happening. So we went to a house party, and it was the same situation there. It was like all these other people that needed somewhere else to go. Like, it was a really desperate situation, actually. Like, it was already like daylight was coming up. And like, it wasn't fun. Like, all the drugs had worn off. Like, you needed more drugs. There was no drugs. It was just one of those situations. And I remember going home, and I felt so defeated. Like, I felt like such a failure, that like I couldn't get as high as I wanted to. Like, I couldn't have like as good enough time as I wanted to. And that was really like it wasn't the last drink I had, but it was the first time I realized that I needed to go into recovery and address my problems. And I just knew that I wasn't going to be able to transition successfully, or transition with a clear state of mind, if I was still drinking and taking drugs. Because, you know, to embark upon a transition, like, you have to navigate so much, like medically, things with the GPs and the doctors, like your family, like there's a lot involved in it. And I knew I couldn't give it the time and space it needed if I was acting in the ways I was doing. So like, I made this commitment to myself that I would stop drinking for a month after I turned 30, and like really focus on everything I needed to focus on. And I did it, and I was really, really grateful that I could, like, it was almost like without going into recovery at that point, I'd surrendered. I knew that like it wasn't going to work for me anymore. I just knew I couldn't carry on. And so I was like, I'll set a challenge. I'll stop drinking for a month. I'll see how it goes. And then I'll decide if I want to carry on or I'll go back to drinking. And that first month of not drinking, I was grateful that I didn't have like major withdrawals. Like, I was never a daily drinker where like I had to have alcohol in first thing in the morning, you know, because the thing I needed to have first thing in the morning was a wank, essentially. Like, that was my main drug, actually. I was like a binge drinker, and I would drink when I was out. I never drank in the house. I never even bought alcohol, to be honest, unless I was out, because it just wasn't attractive to me in that way. So like, kind of coming off alcohol and drugs wasn't the hardest thing, because it wasn't part of my daily life in that respect. So in that sense, it was challenging in the fact that like I had to like deal with some stuff immediately, but it wasn't like I wasn't having the shakes or anything. But I picked up other things again. Like I just started like necking coffee. Like I got my high from like drinking coffee. Like I got my high from like eating cakes again. Like it just was that thing. And because I started to feel really good and physically within my body, because I wasn't having hangovers or come downs, like I hit the gym, and I hit the gym hard. Like, and so exercise became the thing which I, couldn't get enough of. And then it was like compulsive spending. I was like spending all this money on stuff and like amassing all these things. And
I say it's like a game of whack-a-mole. It's like you whack one down and it pops up in another area.
Yeah, totally.
Addiction.
Yeah, that's my.
You've got to get to the root of the problem, haven't you? It's like, until I was speaking to another guy on the podcast. Who was it? Yeah, it was David Essel, and he was saying that, he said, like, we're not bashing 12-step fellowships at all. He said, but what you find is that people go to one particular fellowship and all they do is cross addict onto a plethora of other things, and they never deal with those things. So they're sober, but they're not free from addiction. And that's something that I've realized over the last few years, is like, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter whether it's food or whether it's porn or whether it's shopping or exercise. Unless I deal with the root of the problem, and there's ways of dealing with that, not just through the 12 steps, through counselling, life coaching, whatever the case may be. Psychedelics, that's something that I've done in recovery as well. Unless you deal with those things, with that root of the problem, the spiritual malady essentially, then it never goes away.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. For me, it's really about lack of connection.
Yeah.
That's when I really struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I got to a month of not drinking and not taking drugs, and I felt great. And then I started writing about it on Facebook, actually. This was like April 2012. And some people I knew on Facebook who were in the room started messaging me and were like, oh, you should come to AA. It's like really great. Like, don't be a dry drunk. And I just didn't understand what they meant by dry drunk. And I couldn't comprehend that I was an alcoholic, because in my mind, alcoholics were not people like me. They were like park people who sat on park benches who drank. They were like, I don't know, like Amy Winehouse. It was just like people that I couldn't, I was like, I'm not like that. I'm not a drinker. And I think after 3 months of being sober on my own, I went to my first AA meeting, because my friends were just relentless at saying, like, come to the meetings. And when I went to the first one, it was the LGBTQ one in Angel, and I couldn't relate at all to what the person was saying, because they were a daily drinker and that wasn't my experience. So I sort of drifted off. But I remember they did start talking about alcoholic thinking. And that's when I realized actually that I could relate to what alcoholic thinking was. Like when I thought things, I drank. So if I thought I was crap, I drank because I thought I was crap, all those sort of things. Like that was something that I did. Like if I felt low, I acted out, because I knew that was a way of helping me feel better. And I think the more I went to recovery, in the first few months, I didn't go to recovery all the time. I went like once every 2 weeks or something. I didn't take it seriously. And then I got a call from like people that I used to work with, and they asked me to go and do a gig for them, which was like involved like dancing in a club, what I used to do. And I was like, yeah, I'll go and do it. And I was like, well, if I'm going to do that, I need to get a gram of MDMA, because that's going to sort me through the weekend. So I went and bought a gram of MDMA, and then like lo and behold, like even though I'd been sober for like 6 months, I'd been going to AA for like 2 months, like I took this MDMA and I had a great time. But I knew actually on that come down, I was like, I ended up in the same place. I ended up in a scuzzy dive bar in Dalston at like 1 a.m. on Monday morning, like with the thirst to try and get more drugs, trying to pretend like I was having a good time. Like my shoes were killing me. I was wearing high heels. Like I hadn't like eaten for like 12 hours. And I was just like, I'm in the same place. It's nothing's changed. It's gone nowhere. Like, what is this? And then that was kind of like the last time I did that was the last time I did any drugs until my like big major relapses later. But it was like from then on, I was just like, right, I just need to go into recovery. I really need it, because essentially, like, I'm never going to get better if that's what's happening. And I just saw myself, and I actually was like, the people that I meet in recovery, I want what they have. Like they seemingly like have really like positive things going on, and I don't kind of want to be like druggy. I just don't want that anymore. It's not my life. And that was really helpful. So then I just kind of went back into AA, went to regular meetings, and started taking a bit of responsibility. So I got commitments and everything. And it was really daunting at first. I think also, like, for a lot of trans people, if you don't have access to LGBTQ meetings, it's very hard. Like, to be so in 2012, like, I started my transition, which meant like I took the first steps to like being Rhiannon. So the first things that I could do was like create more of a feminine appearance. So I started dressing in female clothes. I started wearing like makeup, just things that were more attributed to femininity, so that I could be seen as feminine. And actually, like, it's quite difficult to navigate the world when you're like not really seen as like masculine or feminine. Like, when you're in this in-between world, this in-between state, you get like a lot of hassle. And so I was getting like street hassle from people, and because of the way that I looked, because I couldn't easily be defined as male or female, etc. And so going into meetings, like when you're surrounded by strangers, like, is actually quite hard, because you're like, I've got to kind of go in like this. I don't know what the reception's going to be. And it was really like, I was really like, wow, I couldn't believe it, because I found the opposite to be true. Like, I remember the really early Sunday morning meeting in Hackney that used to be in that basement that was like always totally packed. Like, to go into those rooms and like have like heterosexual men be like, hiya, you're all right, like, do you want a cup of tea, like, have a hug, like, I'd never experienced that before from like straight guys. It was always just like, I always used to get aggro. So it was just like, it was quite healing in that. Felt like there was a place where I could go and be me, and it wasn't like people weren't like going, oh my god, look at them, sort of thing. It was really nice. But because I still hadn't addressed my issues of sex and love addiction, like, that actually became really quite addictive for me. So I would try and like maneuver so I could sit next to the guy that I fancied or whatever. Like, I'd try and people please the guys that I liked in the hope to manipulate them to fancy me. Like, all this sort of like kind of weird behavior was happening. But in a sense, what that did do was keep me going back to meetings. So it was quite good in a way. But I think that's why I still don't see lots of trans people in recovery, actually, even though, you know, I've lived in really big cities and I've moved around a lot around the world and been to different meetings everywhere. There's very little representation of trans women in recovery. And I think that's interesting, and probably more needs to be explored. But I mean, I think like it just takes a lot of guts to go in there and be your fullest expression, to walk through that door, essentially, whoever you are. But, you know, there's also other things that you have to take into consideration. So
Yeah, I was going to say that it takes a lot of guts no matter who you are, but when you've got like the added pressure of that, then yeah, it's a huge decision. So, well, hopefully having this conversation, you never know who's going to hear it, so maybe it'll help more trans women and trans men out there to you know, make that decision. But like you said, you know, if you're not in a big city like London where there are all those options, I can imagine it would be much more difficult. You know, somebody who's living out in the countryside like you used to when you were young, to go to a meeting is difficult enough. But, you know, yeah, I could imagine that'd be really tough. Yeah. Thank God for Zoom meetings these days, though. I think that helps. I think that's helped. I mean, I don't think that Zoom is a what's the word? Can take the place, a replacement, of the physical meetings, but it's definitely a bonus these days.
Yeah, definitely bridges that gap, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it enables people to be able to just test it out, you know, to be able to go and just see what it's all about, just get a feeling for it, rather than actually having to physically go. And then when you physically go to the meetings, it's even more powerful.
That's why I'm not so anonymous about my recovery, actually, because like I want to like use the fact that I have had a platform, and the writing that I've done and the presence that I have in the media in some respects is like talk about recovery, because I think like lots of trans people suffer from addiction issues, and I think it's important that there are people out there that are talking about the fact that they are actively, you know, seeking recovery from their addictions. And I'm not particularly worried about the anonymity of it at the moment. But yeah, I knew that like AA was the place where I needed to be, but I still didn't feel like it was exactly, put it this way, like I was going to meetings and people in meetings would be like, oh, I'm so great, I'm so happy, I'm in AA, like it's fantastic, life is great, like really positive. And I can't say I felt that for a long time. I was just like, no, something's not right. I was like, I'm not happy, I'm not positive, like, but I've got sobriety, I don't understand this. And so like you say, talking about like it going into other issues and like other fellowships, like the moment I went to my first SLAA meeting, I was just like, whoa, this is where I need to be. Like all this stuff, all this sexual acting out and sexual acting in, which I've been doing since I was young, I finally found a place I could talk about it. I mean, to some extent in AA, I could talk about the pornography, you know, I could talk about some of the crap relationships and dysfunction in those relationships, but actually like I needed to address it further. And so SLAA was like really fantastic for that. And when I went in there and heard people share, when I found out what sexual anorexia was, I really related to it, like emotional anorexia. Like when I looked at my past relationships, I could really see these patterns of behavior which were really present. And I think for me, like this is much more the family disease, and I can see it now. Like, I mean, I don't want to like diagnose my family with it, but you know, I see characteristics which I can identify and relate to because I have an understanding that they don't. And so I see it with my mum and her partners. I see it with my gran. I see it with my sister. Like it's a really ingrained way of behaving that has been learnt through the generations as a coping mechanism to their own individual trauma responses. Exactly that. That's how I see it now. But it took me a long time to unpick all that, because I was just like, what was interesting is like when I was transitioning, and particularly in the first few years, and I was really like, you know, like blossoming as a woman, like just really kind of like working through those, like life, I suppose. Like my sex and love addiction really escalated because all of a sudden, like I had like more attention than before from guys. And so I was using this attention to like as validation, and I was really getting high off validation for a very long time. And like that's when it tipped, and I had a really like big rock bottom in sex and love addiction, because I was always chasing unavailable people, and they were unavailable because they were predominantly like 90% of the time either in relationships or married, like in a relationship somehow. Like I was never going to get what I wanted from these people because they was like seeing me on the down low. Like they wouldn't want to see me like outside in the day. Like they were too shamed, and they were living deceitfully, you know. And I believe that they were probably also addicts too, in the sense that like that was the way they were dealing with stuff, especially around a lot of shame and fear they had around being attracted to and having sex with transgender women. And that's actually a really big thing. I think like, and for me as like somebody with my addiction stuff, I then used the fact that they were shamed to make it my shame, and I thought that I wasn't good enough, even though I'd taken this huge step forward in terms of expressing myself. That I then realized actually like, no, it's not good enough, because these guys, they don't want to see me. They don't want to see me outside. They only want to see me in the bedroom, sort of thing. So like, that really brought me to my knees, because actually that was as painful as the drink and the drugs were. It was really just like, whoa, what the fuck am I going to do? So like that's when I really started working through SLAA, because I was like, I need this more than ever now. And that was like a real step forward in my growth as in recovery, I suppose. And that kind of like brings us up to date, really. I don't know, like,
what would you say that life in recovery means to you?
I think life in recovery, it's about being in the present. It's about being in the moment. like keeping it in the day. That's what recovery is for me. If I'm in the future, I'm in the past, I'm not in recovery at all, because I'm just like, I'm worrying or obsessing about things that aren't necessarily happening to me right now. And that's really like, yeah, recovery's been about me just being right sized, being right now, I think.
I was in SLAA for a short period of time because I recognized, probably on the flip side to you, alcohol was my number one addiction, and then all the other, like the drugs and the relationships and sex, were the kind of like the add-ons to that like key addiction really. And I got a sponsor, I worked through the program, and actually like I didn't really, one of the things that I never understood was that you can actually go into a fellowship and visit that addiction and like do the work on it and not have to stay in that fellowship. Like I thought, if you join a fellowship, you got to be in it for life. And I've done that with a series of my addictions, and it's really, really helped. So I think that, I always think of addiction like on a gradient, really. Like anybody can be anywhere on that gradient, to a dependent drinker, stroke drug user, heroin user, whatever, a gambler, a sex addict, all the way down to somebody who binges occasionally on these things. And I think that as progressively as well, as you go through your recovery and you're dealing, you're doing whatever work it is that you're doing to deal with all these different areas of your life, you actually get more of a distance from it, and you kind of like develop an ability to choose. I think that's what it really boils down to, actually, because I could pick up a drink tomorrow if I really, really wanted to, but the choice is that I don't want to, because I've got a really great life now. And I can look at all my areas of my life like that. I can think like you did that time. I could think, well, I could go clubbing and maybe do a bit of MDMA, and maybe that wouldn't lead me back to drink. But do I want to have that come down? Or, I could go and have some casual sex, or I could go and, do like have an affair, or whatever the case may be. And actually, I think, well, I've got a beautiful partner. I'm engaged to be married. I've got stepkids. I've got a child of my own. Like, do I want to give those things up? It's a choice these days. I don't get wrapped up in that fantasy anymore. And I lived a lot of my years in recovery thinking the grass was always greener on the other side. I always used to think, oh well, I do still need that. And the fame thing as well. I was very similar to you, because I was a DJ for years. Like it was all, if I just get this, And I don't know about you, but where I'm at right in my life at the moment is like I'm kind of shedding more and more things, because I've realised that like what makes me happy and gives me peace of mind is just the simple stuff, just the family, like and spending my time and concentrating my time on the people who love me and that I love, and not wasting my time on people that actually like they don't bring any benefit to my life, and I don't really give them any benefit, because I'm not in that relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
So like
Mm.
I've loved listening to your story, because I've all the way through, I've been nodding all the way through it and thinking and the beauty of it is as well is that, look, like how different we are as people, and it's just like we've got this common trait that of recovery. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. If you had, oh, sorry, go on.
So on that note, I think what's, like you said, that the kind of like beautifulness of recovery is like going through my transition, like my recovery and my transition have like been like parallel. There's no way I could have transitioned as successfully as I have without having recovery. Like it's really like supported it. Like they're both really important parts of my life. And people who don't necessarily know that I'm in recovery for whatever reason, they're like, oh my God, you're so together, you're so well grounded. Like, being Rhiannon was obviously like the right choice for you. And what they don't know is that I've done like shitloads of work underneath it to be able to like be present, to be able to be here, like exactly what you said, like to focus on the people that I love. It's like that's essentially really like what I've learned in recovery as well, is just to have the focus, like not to like spend time diverting off into all these different things. It's like it's so true.
Well, I think you're a very powerful person, and I really think that you're very brave and courageous, and I'm really glad that we've had the chance to have this conversation, and it's great that you're doing so well. I'm really looking forward to reading your new book as well. I must be honest, I haven't read the first book, so I'm gonna get the first book and then I'm gonna read the second book as well. That'll be out in 2022, did you say?
2021.
21.
August 2021. It's called Help, I'm Addicted, A Trans Girl's Self-Discovery and Recovery.
Beautiful. And what was the first book called?
First book was called The New Girl, A Trans Girl Tells It Like It Is.
Wicked. And where do we find you online?
RyhannonStyles.com.
Brilliant. And have you got one thing that if you had one thing to say to people that might be struggling out there, either with trans issues or addiction or anything like that, what advice would you give?
Talk to people. Don't keep it to yourself. Open up, communicate, engage, become part of a community, get out the house, like get more people in your life. Like really just don't hold these things like on your own. Don't expect that you'll have the answer. Just like, yeah, that's what I would say.
Brilliant. That's awesome, that. Thank you very much for spending the time.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thanks very much for listening, and if you've been affected by any of the subjects discussed in the podcast, check out the links underneath the podcast description for a range of mutual aid organisations, and also don't forget to check out www.lifeinrecovery.co.uk for all my books and social media links. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, visit www.patreon.com/lifeinrecovery. And also just a last word about my sponsor, Dennis Berry Life Coaching. Please visit his website, www.dennisberry.com, for a free consultation and use the code words LifeInRecovery to get 10% off your next 3 sessions. Peace and love, and goodbye for now.